good evening to our friends in Asia. I'm Evan Medeiros. I'm the Penner Chair in Asian Studies and the Kling Family Fellow as part of the U.S.-China Dialogue. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the latest installment of our webinar series looking at critical issues. We've called this series the U.S.-China Dialogue 2020 Event Series. We launched it this spring, and we've had a variety of events that hopefully many of you have enjoyed over the recent weeks and months. Today's discussion is about Taiwan, specifically U.S. policy toward Taiwan, given changes in Washington, changes in Beijing, changes in Taiwan. We felt that now was an important time to take another look at this critical issue. Today's online dialogue is also the first in a series of our newly launched strategic dialogue in the Asia Pacific. It's a collaboration between the Georgetown Initiative on U.S.-China Dialogue, as well as the Asian Studies program in the School of Foreign Service. And this project, this strategic dialogue in the Asia Pacific, is an effort by us to look at China, but from a regional perspective. So we're going to be working with in Asia to advance discussion and dialogue about the U.S.-China relationship and to examine key players in the region. This is an initiative that's jointly led by myself and my colleague in Asian Studies, Professor Mike Green. And so we're very pleased to be able to announce the launching of this strategic dialogue in the Asia Pacific. That's a joint collaboration between the U.S.-China Dialogue and the Asian Studies Department. Today's discussion is going to be focused on Taiwan. As we've done before, a reminder to everybody in the audience that the questions for the panelists should be sent to the following email address: US-China Dialogue, one word, @georgetown.edu. And so the plan for today is we're going to have discussion for about 40 or 50 minutes among the various panelists, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. So as the discussion unfolds, if you have a question you'd like to insert into the queue in the Q&A process, please send it to US-China Dialogue @georgetown.edu. We're very, very lucky today to have an exceptionally distinguished group of panelists to talk about U.S. policy toward Taiwan and to talk about cross-strait relationship, the cross-strait relationship. Each of our panelists today is distinguished for their expertise on global politics, U.S.-China, Taiwan-related issues. And I'd like to take a minute to introduce them. First is Dr. Richard Haass. He's a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on foreign policy with a new book that I highly encourage you to go out and buy and read, and an established leader of nonprofit institutions. Dr. Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's in his 18th year as president of the CFR. Richard has served in and out of government over his career. In the early 2000s, he was the director of policy planning and very actively involved in U.S.-China relations during that time period. He's also worked on issues as varied as Afghanistan and the Northern Ireland peace process. Richard is a prolific author. He's written 14 books, and his latest book, called The World, A Brief Introduction, is on the New York Times bestseller lists. It's certainly one that I recommend to my students, and it's a fantastic way to get up to date on what's going on in the world. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Professor Yen Shui Tong. He's a distinguished professor and dean of the Institute of International Relations at Tsinghua University. He's an editor of many prominent journals. He's a well-known thinker in Chinese foreign policy circles, and he has written numerous books and is one of the thought leaders in China on the question of Taiwan, cross-strait relations, and U.S.-China relations. Third, we have Choi Ren. He's one of the founding members of the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. That's the current ruling party. He's held multiple positions in government, in particular under President Chen Shui-bian in the early 2000s. He was the Secretary General of Taiwan's National Security Council and also Secretary General of the President's Office. He later, in President Chen Shui-bian's term, served as Vice Premier. And he currently runs the New Frontier Foundation as part of the Democratic Progressive Party. Last but certainly not least is Bonnie Glaser, who is a senior advisor for Asia and director of the highly acclaimed China Power Project at CSIS. I highly recommend their website to you. It's an incredible resource. My students use it constantly. Bonnie has worked on Asia-Pacific issues and especially Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations for decades and decades. She's a prolific author, a well-known expert, and widely published. So it's a pleasure to have Bonnie in our panel today. Let's kick it off by going to Richard. Richard, you recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where you raised the question about whether or not the United States needs to make a major shift in its policy toward Taiwan, move away from the policy of strategic ambiguity. In other words, ambiguity about if, when, and how the United States should come to Taiwan's defense in the face of coercion or aggression by mainland China. So Richard, why do you think now is the time for the United States to make that shift, given the apparent anxiety level seems to be growing in both Beijing and Taipei? So over to you, Richard.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Evan, thank you for organizing this. You summed up our position. There we go. It's a simple thesis. It's to replace strategic ambiguity with strategic clarity in terms of the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. No more, no less. Why do this? Why fix something that some would say ain't broke? Why fix something that has succeeded for 40 years? I would say a couple of reasons. One is this is a very different China. This is not Deng Xiaoping's China. This is Xi Jinping's China, which is, to use a diplomatic word, much more assertive in its behavior, both internally and externally, plus much more capable. It has far more options, militarily and otherwise, than it used to have. I'm not particularly worried about the threat of Taiwan declaring its independence. I think there's much more understanding and seriousness there among its leadership than there might have been decades ago. Plus, I think there's growing doubts about U.S. willingness to go to bat for its allies, given certain patterns of behavior around the world. So for all these reasons, I would argue, David Saxon and I wrote this article originally in Foreign Affairs, that we need to again shift from ambiguity to clarity. I'd also just underscore that our stakes here are enormous. And whether we make this shift or not, no one should kid himself or herself. Whether to be certain developments that would affect Taiwan's autonomy, Taiwan's security, and the United States were to be inactive, no one should kid themselves about the repercussions for how the United States would be perceived around the region or the world, or the implications for the region and the world. Now, as Evan knows, because he's participated in it, this idea has gotten a little bit of criticism. I'm actually surprised a little bit at the intensity of the criticism, because again, all that's being suggested here is we change the means, not the ends of policy. But let me just quickly go through why I think the criticisms are misguided. One, it might trigger a Chinese attack. Maybe. But I would argue that doubts about U.S. readiness to respond are much more likely to trigger an attack. And my own study of history suggests that deterrence via certainty is far preferable to deterrence via uncertainty. Some secondly say that this exaggerates China's threat to Taiwan. Maybe, maybe not. What we do know, again, is that China's been acting in a much more assertive way. And if you were worried about the U.S.-Chinese relationship, there's no bigger threat to this relationship than the possibility of the United States and China at loggerheads over Taiwan. Thirdly, the moral hazard argument that if we do this, Taiwan will take steps in the direction of independence. We can stop that. We've influenced Taiwan's diplomatic trajectory and behavior before, and we would do so again privately and publicly. Taiwan would understand that does not have a blank check. Some would say or have said that it's inconsistent with existing policy to U.S. commitment under the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act. That's just dead wrong. Happy to debate that as much and as long as anyone would argue. Nothing here changes the U.S. commitments, statements, policies under the 3 communiques, under the Taiwan Relations Act. Again, only influences means. How we implement that, that's up to us. No one's talking here, by the way, about recognizing Taiwan as an independent country or whatever. Again, you know, it's fine to criticize this, excuse me, for what it is, but don't criticize it for what it isn't. Some have said this is inappropriate for the president to do unilaterally, then fine, bring in Congress. More than happy. I like when Congress is brought into foreign policy. It adds greater predictability and stability. I think we've had too much foreign policy made by the executive branch alone in recent years, which makes it too easy for the successive presidents to change it. It adds a degree of unpredictability that's not helpful. Last and most important, a lot of people have pointed out that if we do this, it won't solve the problem, the gap between U.S. policy and its capabilities. Agree 100%. Agree 100% with that observation. So let's try to narrow the gap between U.S. interests and U.S. capability. This involves lots of things. Military help for Taiwan is one of them. Greater U.S. ability to bring military force to bear in the region would be a second. That could be done through stationing or contingency planning. I think we need all sorts of diplomacy here. It should not be a military-only policy in terms of ways of heading this off and responding to it if it were to happen. All sorts of economic preparations ought to be in place for how we would respond. We ought to be prepared for what I would call gray area scenarios. There's an awful lot between the status quo and amphibious troops making a landing, all sorts of ways of coercing, and we ought to be prepared for those. This need not and should not be done unilaterally. This ought to be totally embedded in U.S. alliance relationships and U.S. partnerships in Asia and in Europe. Indeed, it would be a mistake to turn this into a bilateral issue. And there ought to be diplomacy with China. We do need a real strategic dialogue. I would just simply say, in my experience, anytime the U.S. government calls something a strategic dialogue, it no longer is one. What happens is it gets hijacked by the respective bureaucracies of the various countries. That has happened to the U.S.-China relationship with the strategic and economic dialogue. We need a real dialogue, senior level, private, in which we discuss the full range of issues, including this one. It's really important that each side continue to understand the policies and the interests of the other side. And I'm worried by the lack of serious, sustained, high-level private dialogue between the United States and China. This has the potential to be the defining relationship of this era of history. What we're talking about today happens to be the one issue that probably poses the biggest threat to the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. So for those reasons, I think we have got to adopt policies, both in terms of what we say and what we do, that dramatically decrease the chance for there to be any miscalculation or misunderstanding of the stakes here and what the various parties are prepared to do.
Great, Richard, thank you. That was both comprehensive, analytical, and brief. Let me just come back to you on 3 quick issues. Richard, number 1, is the United States prepared to back up this shift in policy? If we move toward clarity, does the U.S. military really have the capability to support that shift in policy? Number 2, I agree with you that any shift in policy needs to be backed up by U.S. allies. But you know, you talk to thought leaders political leaders in Asia just as much as I do. Do you think the rest of Asia is really willing to follow the United States down this road of being more explicit about Taiwan? Number three, on this issue or on this critique to your argument that many have raised about, Taiwan using it as a blank check, moving toward independence, your response to that was basically, well, we prevented that in the past, we can do it again. But can we be so assured that a new Taiwan leader, is going to be willing to listen to the United States? And is China going to be as willing as the Hu Jintao administration was to accept U.S. assurances? So just any quick reactions to that.
Sure, happy to give quick reactions to all three. Do we have the military capability that we would want to be confident that we could deter or, if need be, defend against such a Chinese attack? No. On the other hand, China's experience militarily, shall we say, has been quite limited for the last 40 years. So I think estimates there, we shouldn't exaggerate. Seems to me this argues for both beefing up Taiwan and beefing up the U.S. response, but also no one should assume that this is a military-only set of responses. As I said, there's a full range of diplomatic options, a full range of economic options, including sanctions of all sorts. So again, how one would respond, exactly when and how, where one would respond, I think that's a matter for policy. That depends upon scenarios and a lot. All I'm saying is I think the weather should be clear. That should be clear, that we would respond. But the mix of instruments, I think that in a sense depends. It always does, and that's as it should be. Will allies support this? I think they will. Let me put it this way, Evan. I would turn it around. How would allies react if there were a major contingency involving Taiwan and the United States sat on its hands? I think that would be more corrosive, more of a danger to America's standing in this part of the world, to its alliance relationships in this part of the world. So I'm not, look, allies don't want to choose between the United States and China. I understand all the unease. They don't want there to be a crisis. Agree 100%. So certain things may not be done. I'm not asking for them to necessarily stand up and join us in a rhetorical change. What I think needs to happen is they need to work with the United States to look at how we make such a scenario less likely and how we prepare for it together if one were to happen all the same. That seems to me eminently doable. And again, we shouldn't kid ourselves of the costs of American inaction in terms of our relationship with Japan, South Korea, and others if such a crisis were to happen. Again, the blank check. I've been involved in that in the past. I think going forward, we would say things publicly and privately to Taiwan. You're right, President Tsai, the current leadership of Taiwan is extraordinarily responsible and careful. Might there be a day when one had different kind of leadership in Taiwan? Possibly. But we would privately and publicly make clear that to put it bluntly, if Taiwan were to do things, say declaring independence or something like that, that triggered a crisis, they shouldn't think that American commitment or help was on autopilot. And I think that's true, by the way, of any allied relationship. All alliances involve not just benefits and rights, but also obligations. Obligations about consultation, obligations about not surprising, obligations about acting responsibly. That would not be different here. Taiwan, if the United States were willing to increase its potential support for Taiwan in certain scenarios, implicit and explicit in that would be certain understandings about, in return, what Taiwan owed the United States.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn now to Professor Yan Shuitong. As I said, Yan Shuitong has been involved in the Taiwan issue for decades. He's a thought leader in China. Professor Yan, two questions to you for your opening presentation. Number one, your reactions to Richard's idea about moving from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. Do you think that would be stabilizing or destabilizing? But I want to make sure that today's discussion isn't totally consumed with that debate, as important as it is. But also, Professor Yan, your views on what appear to be Beijing's changing perceptions of the Taiwan question. We're all aware that Beijing has increased its military presence in and around Taiwan, right? The, recent flights of 36 fighters and bombers across the Taiwan Strait, including crossing the center line. So give us your sense of where do you think Beijing is on the Taiwan question at this point, and how high is the anxiety level? And do you think Xi Jinping feels a renewed or heightened sense of urgency? So over to you, Professor Yan.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Actually, I think I agree with Richard. The idea, clarity, the principle, strategic clarity can stabilize the situation across the Taiwan Strait much more than the ambiguity strategy. Well, actually, the debate about the strategic credibility, clarity and vs ambiguity started from the Clinton's period. That's not a recent issue. This has already for decades. And during Clinton's period, both China and the US prefer ambiguous policy toward the Taiwan issue, because the both sides concerned leave the more room for them to manipulate the situation. Actually, if we recall the history in the last 2 decades, and you find that we have a crisis in 1996, and then we have another dangerous situation in the transience period for the continuity, is leadership. And now we have these problems coming back again. So you see, the ambiguity have never stabilized the situation. And so ambiguity, from understanding why the ambiguity cannot stabilize the situation, is because both sides adopted the ambiguity strategy. And the US ambiguity policy make Taiwan don't know what they can do. And the Mainland China's ambiguity make the Taiwan also don't know what they should not do. And these two ambiguities make the three sides, and no one knows where's the red line. So that means the mutual deterrence cannot play any function. So just now, Richard analyzed the function of the strategic ambiguity from an American perspective. I would do from the two sides. And if we considering, and both China and the US adopt a clear strategy, that means makes the Taiwan knows what they can do and what they cannot do. And also meanwhile, and both China and the US know each other's guideline, the right line. So make no one tries to test the other's right line. No one wants to do it. And then if both sides adopt an ambiguous strategy, that's what happened we saw in the history. And everyone try to take advantage of the other's ambiguity and try to take advantage over the others. So always testing the right lines. So if US adopt clarity strategy and China adopt ambiguous strategy, then what happened? Then Taiwan will know what they can do, but they don't know what they cannot do. There's still, and it's a kind of danger. But if US adopt ambiguous strategy, China adopted a clarified strategy, and Taiwan know what they can now do, but they don't know what they can do. So that's this first scenarios is very clear. So most secure situation is China and US adopt clarified policy toward this region and leave no room for their own selves. Nowadays, each side want to leave more room for them. But if no one leaves the room for them to testing the other side, I think the situation will become more stabilized. And related to just now, Evan's question, how about the current Chinese government? Just now, Richard also reached that. And the current leadership is different from Deng Xiaoping. Actually, ambiguous strategy toward Taiwan not started from Deng Xiaoping. That started from the 1990s, after Deng Xiaoping. This situation started from the 1990s. And since then on, the situation continued for several decades. Today, from my understanding, this policy at the Beijing side the concern of the priority for ambiguous strategy on Taiwan issue is still there. I didn't see any change. I didn't see any signal to change the strategy. So from my understanding, we have the missile test in 1996. So if compared with the missile test in 1996, today seems to me the mainland China policy to Taiwan are not that assertive like 1996. So my understanding, the unstabilized situation across the Taiwan Strait and mainly rooted in the ambiguous strategy adopted by both mainland China and US.
And Professor Yan, could you tell us a little bit about what you think is this current level of anxiety and urgency in Beijing about this issue? Because as you know, one of the most common critiques of this argument is that if the US moves from ambiguity to clarity, that Xi Jinping will feel the need, it will just accelerate the imperative to use force.
Okay. And the first, I don't think that at the mainland China, anyone prepare to take over Taiwan with a military force and initiatively. And second, and at this moment, I think that at Beijing, they are mainly worried about the US upgrading the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan and create more international rooms for Taiwan and to undermine the leadership's legitimacy in China. And third, and at this moment, I don't think and anyone think it is possible for Taiwan authority to formally announce establishing a new Taiwan Republic. And this is not that is not in concern. That means no one thinks it will happen in short term. So when you're talking about anxiety, and it's mainly Beijing worry about the US upgrade diplomatic relationship with Taiwan and create more international rooms for Taiwan. That's it.
Right. So let me draw you out on that point just a little bit more. If Beijing is actually more concerned about Washington than concerned about Taipei, if the US moved from ambiguity to clarity, wouldn't that simply reinforce this most acute anxiety on the part of Beijing and potentially precipitate a coercive response?
Okay. And if US, that day, the Bonnie said that China cannot expect the favorable clarified strategy from the US on Taiwan issue. That's absolutely true. And I think I agree with that. But even the US have an unfavorable and clarified strategy on Taiwan issue, which make Taiwan knows what they can do based on American military protection. This is, for me, I think it's still better because the right line is there. And then Taiwan authority knows that what they cannot do. And if you do something beyond that, you will lose the military protection from the United States. And so from my understanding at that time, and possibly if U.S. clarify its policy toward Taiwan, and maybe as a response from mainland China, also with a clarified policy on this issue, that means to make the two right line very, very close and leave the no ambiguous area for anyone to anything dangerous. So that's what I guess.
Great. And last point for you, Professor Yan. Professor Yan, would you say your viewpoint is a majority or a minority view in China?
I'm minority forever.
Oh, really?
I never be majority. I always a minority.
I know. That's why I asked the question.
I'm always a minority in China.
Great. Wonderful. I'd like to turn now to Choi Ren. Choi Ren, you've been involved in cross-strait relations, Taiwan's policy toward mainland China, U.S.-Taiwan relations for decades. You're one of the founders of the DPP, the first opposition party in Taiwan. You've had a very distinguished career in government, obviously as an advisor to Chen Shui-bian. So you know this history very, very well. I'd welcome your views on how Taiwan's perceptions, both elite perceptions and popular perceptions of China and cross-strait relations are evolving. Whether or not you think that the United States should move from ambiguity to clarity, and generally your view of the prospects for cross-strait relations in the future. So over to you, Choi Ren.
Okay, let me look at this issue from a little theoretical perspective, and I will respond to these issues from the so-called game theory. You know that the relationship between the Taiwan and China, to me, is a kind of a zero-sum game. Not because China always claims Taiwan is a part of China, and Taiwan reject that. And so far, I cannot find any possibility that both sides want to change this kind of the position. And according to the game theory, without the third party step in, the zero-sum game, the structure of the payoff, the zero-sum game, only can lead to the hot confrontation with each other. So I think if we want to face how to deal with this kind of zero-sum game, we want to change the structure of the payoff to ease down the tension of both sides. I think we need the third party step in to change the structure of the payoff. And to me, United States is this third party. I know that many people say that try to defend Taiwan, US try to defend Taiwan, is growing hostile. But we don't forget, under current capability, the China also will pay more cost than US if both sides want to take the action. So I think the US right now still the best candidate to be the third party. And so if US continue to maintain the strategic ambiguity, that means the structure of the payoff of this game will continue to be ambiguous. Then both sides will continue try to test, try to maintain those kind of the zero-sum game payoff. And it's not good for both sides, and it's also not good for this region. So from my point of view, I think that the strategic clarity implemented by US will change the structure of the payoff of this game, change this game from zero-sum to non-zero-sum. And it's good for this area and good for most countries. And so I think that the US take this kind of the strategic shift. I must add one thing. It's a kind of the so-called double clarity. The clarity not only to Taiwan, but also to China. Under what kind of the situation, US will take the action to warn Taiwan and to warn China. And even both sides still want to test, but if the strategic clarity, so both sides quite clear what kind of the cost for them to test. And I think the clarity can make certain kind of the restrictions to both sides that because the structure of the payoff changed already when US step in. So from my point of view, I want to say that the strategic clarity create a new game from zero-sum to non-zero-sum and can ease down the tension of this area. And this kind of clarity is a double clarity, not only to China or not only to Taiwan, but must to both sides. And I know that the US, a lot of scholars mention that they don't want to give the blank check to Taiwan, but I think the clarity, including what kind of the payoff US want to pay it, And I think Taiwan and China clearly understand that. Then I think even both sides have their own dream. But I think the both sides smart enough will save a lot of energy and resources, try to stop certain kind of the zero-sum game. That's what I mean.
Interesting, interesting. So Choi Ren, let me come back to you on a few issues. First, why aren't you, as a Taiwan citizen, why aren't you concerned about clarity provoking the mainland? You're well aware of how their coercion and aggression has grown in recent weeks and months. Xi Jinping clearly has strong views on the Taiwan question. You're not concerned about mainland responding in a way that penalizes Taiwan, not America?
Actually, I have my own interpretation about recent Chinese summer activities. To me, that because the strategic ambiguity caused China very anxiety, such as Taiwan control the border to prevent the COVID-19 invade Taiwan, and China have different interpretation. That's because they think perhaps Taiwan try to pursue independence, so they want to control the borders. For example, US improved the relationship with Taiwan, and China have their own interpretation, or whether US try to help Taiwan to pursue the independence, whether Taiwan try to declare independence someday, something like that. And those kind of the different interpretation all comes from the ambiguity. If both sides can clearly this action or this move based on what kind of the meaning, I think can lower down this kind of the misunderstanding, misinterpretation with each other.
Mm-hmm. And Choi Ren, talk to us a little bit about changing elite and popular views in Taiwan on the issue of China and cross-strait relations. Tsai Ing-wen had a very resounding victory earlier this year. The Hong Kong issue and the Taiwan issue clearly have become linked. So if you're looking at Taiwan opinion from the mainland perspective, it doesn't look particularly positive. So can you give us a sense of how views in Taiwan are evolving on the question of cross-strait relations?
Yes, the public attitude of the public changed a lot, especially in this year. From this January and February, that China makes so-called the one country, two system of Taiwan model. And then in the summer of this year, the Hong Kong issue become very hot to Taiwan. And so to a lot of Taiwanese people, the one country, two system means a kind of the so-called one China. And this one China try to interpret the so-called Taiwan model. So cause Taiwanese people very nervous, and we cannot accept that kind of so-called the Taiwan formula. Even China try to explain, the so-called one country, two system and the Taiwan formula have a kind of a different interpretation or different meanings. But through the Hong Kong actual activity, Taiwanese people, most of Taiwanese people cannot accept the PRC's interpretation about the so-called Taiwan formula. That's because the reality happened in Hong Kong, shocked Taiwanese people a lot. And we cannot accept that kind of the performance and the policies.
And if that's the case, if the people of, on Taiwan are no longer prepared to accept the one country, two systems formula, what does that mean for the possibility of future reunification?
Lots of the possibilities still exist, but from Taiwanese people, at least we insist that must have certain kind of value emerge in this kind of the models, such as the human rights, the democracy, and the liberty, something like that. So any kind of model Taiwan want to discuss with China, but those kind of the value cannot be compensated. This model must include these kind of important value.
Right. So, Choi Ren, last question to you. You obviously, as one of the founders of the DPP, know the thinking well, especially among the sort of deep green thinkers and voters in the DPP. You know, are you concerned at all that if the U.S. moved toward strategic clarity, that it would provide an incentive for future leaders of Taiwan to push the envelope, to explore the boundaries of U.S. support? And I say that because you work for a president of Taiwan who did exactly that. You know, one of the most tense crises in U.S.-Taiwan relations over the last 20 years has been under President Chen Shui-bian. President Bush sat in the Oval Office in 2003 with the Chinese premier next to him, criticizing the president of Taiwan. So from an American perspective, the concern about a future Taiwan leader, I agree with Richard Haass's characterization. Tsai Ing-wen has been incredibly responsible. But we don't know what kind of leader from the DPP will emerge in the future. As a party, it's evolving. So could you, as one of the founders of the DPP, help us understand the thinking and the risks involved here?
So 2 points I will say. The first one that you mentioned about the former President Chen Shui-bian. In some sense, I know that from American perspective, they think that the former President Shui-bian was not responsible, the president. And even under this kind of situation, you know that finally, that Mr. Chen Shui-bian still stopped do something. So I mean that any realistic politician, they must understand what kind of the capability we have, Taiwan have, what kind of resources we have, what kind of relation Taiwan want to maintain with the US. Quite clear, any realistic person, except he is crazy. So the number one, even President Chen finally stopped to do something. The second one, I think that the Taiwanese people is more changed a lot. Now, for example, when I was a student, I cannot accept the so-called Republic of China equal to Taiwan, actually French speaking. But right now in Taiwan, most of people think the Republic of China, Taiwan is quite natural. And this kind of a change means the public of Taiwan is more realistic. And this kind of realistic situation, I don't believe we are elected a crazy person to be the Taiwan president.
Great. So Taiwan, ultimately, the people, the government are pragmatists, and that will be the constraint on any kind of.
Yeah, from my point of view, I just mentioned to the even President Chen.
Even President Chen.
Still cannot do something.
Great, great. So I want to bring in our fourth speaker. Bonnie is a very distinguished writer, thought leader, and commentator on cross-strait issues. Bonnie, you wrote one of the critiques in response to Richard and David's article. So I'd welcome you sort of running through your arguments, and you obviously heard the discussion and Richard's responses to your critique. But I'd also like to hear your views a little bit about the direction of US policy toward Taiwan, what you think has driven actions in recent weeks and months, and what concerns you going forward. So over to you, Bonnie.
Well, thank you, Evan, for having me today. And Richard Haass has disappeared for the moment, but I want to thank him, Richard, for stimulating a really interesting debate and writing a really stimulating and provocative article with your co-author. So let me just make 4 points from my argument against strategic clarity. And I must admit, I'm a little surprised. I'm the outlier today. I'm the only one of the 4 of us who is arguing against this. Yes, sorry, Yan Shui Tong, you don't get to be in the minority today. So, first of all, I think it's important to assess the risk to Taiwan of a Chinese invasion. And my own view as an analyst is that there is no imminent danger of a Chinese invasion, despite, of course, the buildup of PLA capabilities. China has successfully thwarted de jure Taiwan independence. And that is Beijing's only real fear. Reunification, of course, remains the goal, but there's just no urgency to achieve it. Why would Xi Jinping put the top priority of national rejuvenation at risk by attempting to seize Taiwan? I would note that nothing that Xi Jinping has said suggests a crisis is looming. And he is the authoritative voice, not the nationalist screeds in the Global Times. The uptick in PLA operations around Taiwan are part of China's strategy of putting gray zone pressure on Taiwan, not sign of an invasion. And in my view, we should be thinking much more deeply about how to make Taiwan more resilient in the face of those gray zone tactics, which are really aimed at reducing the confidence of the Taiwan public in its government. Second, the US must maintain credible deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And I think this is something that Richard and I certainly agree on. Deterrence is eroding. And this requires investing in advanced weapon systems and developing new operational concepts to counter China's asymmetrical advantages. A policy of unconditional support for Taiwan in the absence of shoring up deterrence, I believe, may well provoke the attack that we seek to prevent. Let's all admit that decision-making in Beijing is somewhat of a black box these days. There isn't really a collective leadership. Xi Jinping may in fact be vulnerable to criticism that he is too soft in response to threats to Chinese sovereignty. So I think that Professor Yan's argument actually contains some contradictions. Third, strategic clarity, I still believe, despite these statements of the other speakers, could provide a blank check to backers of independence in Taiwan. Yes, we all share the assessment that President Tsai Ing-wen is prudent and cautious. But frankly, my discussions with potential future leaders in Taiwan lead me to conclude that her successor may not be so pragmatic. And contrary to the statistics that actually Richard and David cited in their article, some polls show that the percentage of people supporting independence in Taiwan is actually growing considerably. I'll cite one poll that was taken about 6 months ago that found 54% of respondents supported independence and only 23.5% preferred maintaining the status quo. So I would argue that a policy of dual deterrence is still necessary. Today, Taipei's interests do align with the United States, but they may diverge in the future. And then finally, I believe that there would be indicators of an emerging crisis. An attack is unlikely to come out of the blue. And if the United States assesses that the chances of a PRC attack are growing, a private warning to Xi Jinping assuring him that the US will not stand idly by, to use a Chinese phrase, is likely to have greater effect. Once again, however, the US must seize the opportunity today that exists now to ensure that the threat of US military intervention is credible. So, Evan, you asked me to comment a bit on what US policy toward Taiwan might be after the presidential election, so I'll just make a couple of very brief points about that. If President Trump is reelected, I think it will depend on his national security team. You know, the policy of strengthening ties with Taiwan has really been driven by several key individuals in the Trump administration, not by the president himself. We all know that Trump got burned before he was inaugurated when he had a phone call with President Tsai Ing-wen. And he considered at the time not reaffirming the US one China policy. And the fierce reaction from China left him chastened and averse to trying again to use Taiwan to pressure Beijing. So I would not expect that we would have a major shift in policy, but you know, personalities and individuals matter. In my view, a Biden presidency would not pursue a significantly different policy on Taiwan than we've seen under the Trump administration. Support for Taiwan might be less public and less visible than under Trump, maybe specific policy decisions like an arms sale might be timed to minimize the negative impact on US-China relations. But the trajectory of US policy is likely to be unchanged. In the United States, support for Taiwan really is at an all-time high. I think maybe when my colleague Mike Green comes into this conversation, he'll tell us that a little bit about our recent polls that CSIS is going to release later this week. And there is evidence of growing support among the American public for taking risks to defend Taiwan, almost as high as support for Japan, Korea, and Australia. And this is partly a function of a rise in negative sentiment toward Taiwan, but it's also the result of increased appreciation for Taiwan's democracy and its exemplary handling of the coronavirus. Congress is now considering yet more legislation to strengthen US-Taiwan relations. So regardless of the outcome of the presidential election, the US will continue to strengthen ties with Taiwan. How it does that, however, will be decided partly based on Chinese actions. So if Beijing continues to ramp up pressure on Taiwan, the next US administration will not be intimidated. And I think a Biden presidency will be particularly keen to not be seen as privileging cooperation with China or being perceived as weak. Back to you, Evan.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Bonnie, three quick comebacks to you. Point number one, you started out by saying you don't think Xi Jinping is particularly anxious right now, but yet you think that moving to strategic clarity could prompt Beijing to take military action. Could you sort of connect those two disparate strands? I mean, if they're not particularly anxious right now, why would shifting to strategic clarity sort of prompt that? Because that suggests that there's a big change going on right there. Second point is about gray zone. You talked about how China increasingly is using gray zone tactics. Isn't that an argument for moving to strategic clarity? Because if you don't have strategic clarity, the Beijing will continue to sort of slice up the salami. So maybe you could sort of walk us through that piece. And then third, you talked about changing opinion in the United States on the Taiwan question. And I want to ask you about the issue of US-China strategic competition. There are a lot of voices, especially in the Congress, in particular in the Senate, that are increasingly framing the US-China competition as sort of a new Cold War. To what extent does the issue of US policy toward Taiwan cross-strait relations cease being about cross-strait relations in Taiwan and increasingly become about managing US-China strategic rivalry, a new Cold War? What do you think about those points?
Great questions, Evan, and I'll just try to be brief. On the issue of anxiety in China and the imminency of attack, so I believe that if the United States were to take a position of strategic clarity, this connects to what I said earlier about our not fulsome understanding of decision-making in Beijing. So Xi Jinping might be backed into a corner. He has spoken, I think, very clearly, publicly, many times about sovereignty. In fact, told a US Secretary of Defense, China will never give up sort of 1 inch of territory. And so if the United States really backs Xi Jinping into a corner by publicly taking a position of strategic clarity, the Chinese may then believe that this is a moment where the US actually does not have the capability to counter China's anti-access area denial capabilities. So better to act sooner rather than later. So that's the response to that question. On the gray zone issue, if the United States were to essentially abandon strategic ambiguity, then we are telling China it can really do anything up to the line of invading. That's what red lines do, right? I mean, countries then do everything else but that final thing, which we're talking about here is invasion. And so that could lead China to go ahead and feel it has the ability to steal all of Taiwan's remaining 15 diplomatic partners, to do much more against them in terms of military pressure, economic pressure, which we have seen actually very little of. There could be a lot more. And again, I think this is really aimed at convincing the people of Taiwan that they just have no choice but to accommodate to Beijing's wishes. And I think this would make the situation quite dangerous because we don't have a good tool set to respond to China's ever expanding gray zone toolkit.
So you think strategic clarity would actually accelerate and expand these gray zone operations because the Chinese would seek to sort of slice the salami up until the red line, so to speak.
So I think it makes the situation quite dangerous.
Interesting.
And then finally, I want to agree with your last point that, and it connects to what Professor Yan Shui-Tong said earlier, that China is really right now quite worried about US policy and far less so about Taiwan's policy, because Beijing sees the changes in US policy toward Taiwan as part of the intense US-China competition. And we know that virtually every person in China talks about the US using Taiwan as a card against China, trying to contain China. Some people think that the United States actually doesn't care very much about Taiwan, which of course is completely wrong, and I think a misunderstanding of US policy. But as China grows more suspicious about US intentions, including a potential objective of weakening and overthrowing the Communist Party, as the Trump administration has repeatedly talked about the Chinese Communist Party being the problem, not the Chinese people, and talked about empowering the Chinese people to induce change in China. Then I think Beijing looks at this issue of Taiwan differently, because Taiwan is long seen as when Mike Green was at the White House, as a beacon of democracy. That's what President Bush called Taiwan. So I think that trend is a very worrisome context in which we are discussing this issue of strategic clarity.
Great, interesting. So we're now at 10 o'clock. We've got 30 minutes left. Before we move to Q&A, and we've got our friend and colleague Mike Green as questioner number one. I just want to turn back to Richard, Yan Shui-Tong, Choi Ren, and see if any of them, if you want to respond to anything. We've had a lot of comments, a lot of rich comments, interesting debate. So Richard, let me go to you first. You're not obligated, so feel free to pass. But if there's anything, we'd love to get your reactions to the debate so far.
Reactions. One, I'm pleasantly surprised to see the general, Bonnie accepted, support for strategic clarity. Again, it's not an anti-Chinese position. I'm on record, as you know, Evan, saying that I want this relationship to be one that allows for limited US-Chinese cooperation on a range of challenges, from North Korea to climate change. And I'm pushing this not as an anti-Chinese position, but rather as a way to stabilize this important relationship. And again, there's a lot of history that argues that deterrence is much more robust when it's based on clarity than it is on ambiguity. I want to take issue, but one of Bonnie's points, or two of them, I found really baffling. One is she said that Chinese decision-making is a black box, and then seemed to predict all sorts of adverse consequences if we move towards strategic clarity. I don't see how those two are consistent. And also, this even more troubling to me was the argument that if we move towards clarity, it opens up all sorts of actions short of amphibious landings of armed attack for China to do. That's absolutely wrong. If we move towards clarity, it's not clarity only in the event of a certain type of Chinese response. It is clarity of American support for that the future relationship between China and Taiwan will not be resolved forcibly or coercively. And we have, again, infinite range to determine how it is we respond to anything in the gray area, or how it is we don't respond, or we could respond economically or diplomatically. No one should assume that our only responses are in the worst possible case scenario, and no one should assume that our responses are limited to military tools. Indeed, I think there's a pretty good argument that some of our best tools might be diplomatic and economic, given where China is. So again, we need to develop our toolkit here. No art, and I think there we agree. But I simply don't understand the logic of an argument of moving towards clarity as opening up a greater scope for Chinese adventurism or pressure. Just the opposite, because again, we retain all our flexibility about when and how and where to respond and with what.
Great, thank you, Richard. Bonnie, did you want to respond? You don't have to. We can sort of keep going in the conversation, but I want to make sure you have an opportunity.
Well, I'm sure we could go on for hours on this. Richard, I do think that the Chinese would. First of all, on your first point, I think I've already responded to that. I really think that your arguments fail to take into account domestic politics, both in China and in Taiwan. And in China in particular, we have a situation where Xi Jinping is moving towards his third term, very sensitive period. 2022 is going to be the next party Congress, and he is going to want to show that he is able to not deliver unification with Taiwan, but that he is managing well China's external environment, as well as, of course, its internal situation and its economy being at the forefront of that. And maybe Professor Jens Reitong would disagree with all of this, but I believe that China could see a statement of strategic clarity as a challenge. I mean, if we look at the whole history of how sensitive Taiwan was in the negotiations between the United States and China, this is the most explosive and most dangerous issue. And in the context of a Trump administration that has taken all the positions it has vis-a-vis China, to go this one step further at this particular moment in time, I really think could provoke a very strong response from China. On the gray zone issue, I would point just, the example of China demanding several years ago that all airlines, in the world stop using Taiwan or referring on their websites and other propaganda material, informational material, that Taiwan was a separate country, and how the United States actually just didn't have a very strong ability to respond to that kind of challenge. You look at what's going on with the fighters and bombers flying now across the center line in very large numbers, something we really hadn't seen as a deliberate action for the last 20 years. I personally am quite concerned about the potential for an accident between Chinese and Taiwanese pilots. Strategic clarity is not going to solve that problem. You probably would agree with that, but maybe you disagree. So I think we're focused on the wrong issues. I think we need to focus on the real threats that are taking place, and not expect that just, if we make a declaratory statement that sort of, we wash our hands of it and we've solved the problems here, because there's a huge number of problems that I think we're going to see going forward regarding supply chains, for example, and Taiwan's really critical role in those supply chains when it comes, for example, to semiconductors. And China may take some actions in that regard. So I just think we need to be focused on the right set of challenges rather than get distracted with this one, which I think won't solve the issues that we face and could produce a crisis.
Thanks, Fonny. I think your latter intervention raises an important point. There are a variety of issues on the U.S.-Taiwan agenda, and perhaps there are ones that are more important, like actually developing a more systematic economic relationship with Taiwan and modernizing our economic relationship, and the movement towards strategic clarity that Richard talks about actually could short circuit that. So that's another interesting angle on this particular issue. Choi Ren or Yin Shui Tong, did you want to come back in here? Let's go to Choi Ren first, Yin Shui Tong, and then we'll go to Q&A. Choi Ren?
Yeah, I think I learned history, the lesson quite different from the Barney. That because to me, I think that because the ambiguity caused the Chinese leaders' anxiety, not because the clarity caused Chinese leaders' anxiety. That's my interpretation and that's my understanding. So I think the clarity actually that China and Taiwan can focus more their energy to deal with their diplomatic relations, to deal with the local economy, or to deal such as the so-called supply chain, something like that. That because is clearly some kind of the limitation. Both sides must face it. And if both sides don't want to face this kind of the limitation, I think either side will pay a lot of cost. And I believe the leaders of both sides, not the crazy person, they are realistic one. They quite understand those kind of the cost. Taiwan or China cannot afford that. That's my understanding.
Thank you, Choi Ren. Yin Shui Tong?
Okay, well, actually, just now Bonnie said that the Americans' strategic ambiguity will leave opportunity for China to enlarge the GRISM. Well, this logic seems to me it doesn't works, cannot hold water. The reason is that any GRISM is created by ambiguous strategy. Because the ambiguous, then you have a GRISM. Without ambiguous, how can you have the GRISM? And also, Evan, you said that you find that a country may take the opportunity to slice the tsunami. That's true, because both China and US adopt strategic ambiguity, so make the three sides, China and the US and the Taiwan authority, also every side to slice the tsunami. That is why it's dangerous. That's why ambiguity makes the situation so unstable and very dangerous. As now Mr. Hugh said that the game between mainland China and Taiwan is zero-sum game. I totally agree. And just because this is a zero-sum game, so that means you cannot change the payoff. The payoff is clear. It's a zero-sum game. So the only thing is to maintain the stability based on zero-sum game. What you can do, and based on the mutual deterrence between China and the US. And during the Cold War, the mutual deterrence actually works pretty well, prevent the war between US and Soviet Union. So if China and the US adopted a strategic clarity to make this a mutual deterrence on Taiwan issue, it's very clear. It will work again. It doesn't repeat the function of the mutual deterrence strategy. So in that way, if China and the US adopt strategic ambiguity, and the mutual deterrence will become solid and reliable, and then no one is going to slide the tsunami, and the situation will be stable.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left. We've got a great list of questions, but a reminder for all of our watchers and listeners today, please email us at uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu, and we'll put your question in the queue. For the first question, I want to go to my colleague and friend, Professor Michael Green, Director of Asian Studies, and all-around guru on Asian security affairs. And I have to highlight that Mike actually has the unique experience as having been one of the senior U.S. diplomats who is involved in managing complicated U.S.-Taiwan ties during the Chen Shui-bian era. So, Mike, I welcome any comments that you might have on strategic ambiguity U.S.-Taiwan relations, but please also add on a question for our distinguished panel today. So, over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Evan, and thank you to all the panelists. This has been fascinating and unexpected. And I have to say, when I read the foreign affairs piece that Richard and his colleague put out, my first reaction was that I was intrigued, but like all good veteran Asia hands, I was apprehensive about tinkering with the canonical statements on cross-Straits issues. But listening to this discussion, I actually find myself leaning much more closely to Richard's proposition. If you think of this not as a binary choice, but as a rheostat, if we think of it as calibrating our declaratory policy and not departing from what we've done dramatically, but just adjusting it. So, for example, in the Bush administration, we had a clear statement that the United States opposes unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. So I could imagine a rheostat adjustment of that says we will use necessary means to oppose unilateral changes to the status quo. And I think that would be justified. I think the gray zone pressures and the uncertainty about how far Xi Jinping is willing to go in the use of those coercive tools, I think that is a pretty strong argument for adjusting our declaratory policy. A couple caveats, though. One is maybe Richard was a little too cavalier about allies. I know he thinks they're important. Europe would be good to have. Australia and Korea would be good to have. We cannot execute without Japan. Our ability to defend Taiwan is now impossible without Japanese support. But I think the Japanese position is also pretty tough. Bonnie mentioned this survey we've done at CSIS, and we're rolling it out and turning the website live Tuesday, tomorrow at 10:30. But we asked the public and we asked leaders in 12 major national associations like the Chamber of Commerce about policy questions on China and on Taiwan, especially among business and academic and human rights leaders, remarkably strong support for defending Taiwan. So I think Richard's proposal is sellable politically. But here's the thing, Bonnie raises very good points about how it would be viewed in the current context. So my question for Bonnie is, you kept coming back to how much President Trump is, making this a dangerous proposition, but let's say it's 6 months or a year from now and it's a different president. Would that change your calculation? And my question for Richard is, am I being too moderate? Would a rheostat calibration to address the gray zone challenge work for you, or do you want the whole shebang? Do you want an unambiguous and unconditional clarity that we would defend Taiwan? So really interesting discussion, which I think has done a lot of good, actually. I hope people watch this and debate it, because it's remarkable how much Yan Shui-tong and Choi Ran agree with each other. So Richard, you got to keep writing these because you're stabilizing cross-state relations. Thanks, and over to you.
Okay, let's go to Bonnie first and then Richard. Bonnie?
All right, I do want to say, Mike, that other Chinese that I have talked to, as Professor Yen already acknowledged, have a very different position. And one retired PLA officer in a conversation that we had, that Professor Yen and I were both part of, said, and as well as Evan, in fact, that it could cause a strategic confrontation and a military confrontation between the U.S. and China. So let's just at least make clear that we don't have everybody in China that would agree with Yan Shui-tong's position. Mike, I really want to agree with you. And in my short article in Foreign Affairs, I was really given a very strict word limit. I did put in a couple of sentences at the end that was an effort to say exactly what you have just stated. I didn't say, of course, it's like a rheostat, but the point is that in this particular context, I think that we do need to warn China against using military force against Taiwan. And if there are signs of a real crisis, we should be, in fact, issuing that kind of warning, perhaps privately. And I know Evan, I think, was involved, or maybe this was after your time, Evan, when President Obama did warn Xi Jinping about dredging at Scarborough Shoal. And that was a private communication that apparently did have some impact. So I would distinguish between taking positions publicly and privately. But I do agree with you that there is a need for tougher position. I just don't think strategic clarity is the right response now. And if in 6 months to a year, we have to assess how much has changed in that regard. What has changed in the U.S. China-Taiwan trilateral relationship. So I don't rule out that circumstances might require it, but I think we'd have to be very, very careful about ensuring that it doesn't have the negative consequences that I have and others have pointed out, such as emboldening those in Taiwan or leading to the attack from China that it is we seek to deter.
Great. Richard, Mike asked you a twofer, the rheostat position and the question of allies. So, Richard?
Let me turn first to the rheostat or dial. I always like that image. Very few things in diplomacy are switches. Look, I think our policy should be, we are not only going to respond to an all-out armed attack. We reserve the right to respond to other scenarios. And we won't only respond using military force of our own, which is another way of saying we're sensitive to a full range of scenarios and situations. And we are prepared to avail ourselves of a full range of foreign policy instruments. That's called a rheostat, both in terms of what triggers it and how we respond. And I think, we could work up language that we are prepared, again, to fulfill our commitments under the 3 communiques in the Taiwan Relations Act, to use necessary and appropriate means, whatever. We could play with the writing, but the idea that look, all alliances have discretion. If you read the treaty language, it always talks about constitutional processes and so forth. It's not, no alliance is 100% automatic, and no alliance is black or white in terms of what might trigger it and how you might respond. So again, I think this degree of, if you want to call it a rheostat or discretion, it's inevitable in any security relationship. So I don't see this as an outlier. And by the way, I think it should be said, not just publicly, but privately. Again, this is not an anti-Chinese position. This is not seen as something that is a hostile shot across their bow. That's why Professor Yan's comments to me were so welcome. That clarity is meant to be stabilizing, not destabilizing. Look, I think with allies like Japan and others, I agree with Mike, and knows a lot more about it than I do. It's critical. One of the things that's fallen into disrepair in recent years has been consultations with allies. So I would think that if we are going to move towards a stance like this, we've got to prepare the way. We just prepare the way with China, prepare the way with Taiwan, so we don't have the moral hazard argument, and prepare the way with America's allies. And as I said, whether it's Japan or South Korea or European allies or what have you, Australia, we would want to have some understandings about the range of scenarios that would trigger various kinds of responses. That's what consultations are all about. And I also think there probably need to be a public side of it, because this hasn't been a debate that's been conducted with any degree of regularity. So I'm a great believer that diplomats operate best when they operate in a context that to some extent they've created. So I would think that we need to approach this both with a private dimension with various parties and with a public dimension in the region, and also here at home. You should never be staking out commitments without Congress and the American people understanding what we signed up for and why. So I think this has to be embedded in a much larger effort.
Richard, thank you. I'm going to go to the long queue of questions that I've got, and most of them are very long and very detailed. So I'm going to paraphrase. So, question for you, Richard. Richard, let's say COVID didn't exist. You go to Beijing next week, and you sit down with Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and make this pitch. How do you think Beijing looks at this issue, putting Professor Yen's views aside? What's your perception of how Beijing would respond? Let me just put that out there. And then Choi Ren, there's a question to you about the changing political spectrum in Taiwan, and in particular, the fact that the KMT itself has started moving away from the so-called 1992 consensus. And the question is basically, don't you see Taiwan really moving away from any interest in a negotiated solution with mainland China? So maybe Choi Ren, since you haven't spoken too much, I want to ask you to answer that question and then come back to Richard on this issue of parachuting into Beijing. Choi Ren?
I'm not a KMT member, so I just answer this question from my personal point of view.
Yes.
So I have a feeling that the internal debate happening within the KMT. Recently, some the legislator of the KMT raised the issue that we are pro-US and try to make a friend with the China. That means make a friend with US. I think right now is a very important element within the KMT. The second one that the one leaders of the KMT caucus mentioned that KMT must change their name without China, only the KMT or the Republic of China's KMT, something like that. So I think that the KMT have some kind of the debate or something happen right now within the KMT. That the way that they will want to maintain the so-called traditional Chinese character. And so I think this kind of the debate will cause certain kind of a change in the later on. And so far, I think that from my point of view, I think I welcome this kind of the debate happening in KMT. That because if the KMT can find a new way, that means that most of the Taiwanese people in this island have the consensus about the Taiwan first, something like that. And then I think it's better if we have this kind of consensus. Then I think how to deal with the China. I think we can find some kind of the easy way, and we don't need to spend a lot of the cost to deal with the internal problems. And so I think the debate happened.
Doesn't that suggest that Taiwan really is on this inevitable drift away from the mainland? If the KMT itself is moving towards, as you put it, Taiwan first.
Yeah, let me say that the KMT tried to change its name, and from the present time, you can find that the Republic of China, Taiwan. So from another angle, that both sides move toward the middle. That the KMT gradually try to think about whether we want to maintain the China, and the Taiwan gradually move that we can in the past we can only accept the Taiwan, but right now I think the current administration can accept Republic of Taiwan, Republic of China, Taiwan. So from another angle, I don't think it's a real. I think from another angle, that means the Taiwan gradually find some kind of consensus and move to the middle. That's my feeling.
Interesting. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Look, my view is that this could be presented in a way that would be quite well received in China. It obviously depends upon the context of U.S.-Chinese relations. If I were ever to go there as an official, it would not be against the backdrop of calling for regime change. It would not be against the backdrop of periodic insults about China viruses and the rest. It would be against the backdrop of a serious effort to stabilize the relationship. Essentially, we push back where we have to, including here, but we carve out areas of selective cooperation. Obviously, emphasize the continuity and the fidelity to the commitment to the three communiques. I also think that The Chinese might be more worried at times about some of the symbolic upgrades and anything that looks like a way station to independence. And my enthusiasm for those kinds of symbolic steps is finite. I'm actually interested in serious things here, not in pulling the tail, tweaking China over this. And I think if we did it with the right kind of consultations, domestically and internationally, they would realize that this was something that was broadly supported. And they would have to think twice or three times before taking steps that would create, again, it's not just a military response, but an economic and diplomatic response that would work against so much of what China has built. So again.
So Richard, you'd take your time, do it very carefully, maybe start out privately. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but at some point, I think it's important to also do it publicly because public commitments have a certain significance that private commitments don't. But yeah, I mean, if you want to accuse me of believing that diplomacy should be a careful enterprise and conducted with a degree of professionalism privately and publicly, I plead guilty.
Yeah, unfortunately, the last 4 years have made us all forget that very important point. So for our last question, I'm going to go to Professor Yan Shui-Tong. Yan Shui-Tong, we have a question here that asks you to sort of put your forecasting hat on a little bit and give us your assessment of how China is thinking about the future of U.S.-China relations and the future of U.S. policy toward China. What are Beijing's expectations about a Biden presidency? What are Beijing's expectations about a second Trump term? Professor Yan?
Well, it's obvious. And if Biden win the election and gaining the power in the White House, his policy toward China will be different from what the Trump's policy. But it doesn't mean this is only technical change. It's not a strategic. And they will adopt the strategy toward China with the same goal. That means try to slow down the China's technical progress to catching up with the US. If they can enlarge the gap, technology gap, that's fine. If they cannot, at least they slow down the speed of the gap, narrowing the gap. And the second, Biden will adopt a multilateral strategy to deal with China. That means we'll work closely with Japan or the traditional allies, and not like the Trump adopt the unilateral strategy against China. So I think this is two main differences between the Trump and the Biden. But then because the goal the same, exactly the same. So no matter Trump will continue his presidency or the Biden take over the power, and the China-US relationship will continue to be deteriorated. And I cannot see any chance to make the bilateral relationship to resume. And related to Taiwan issue, I would agree with Bonnie on this. And Biden's policy toward Taiwan may be not that open, but the substance will be the same, like what the Trump adopted. And so I would say that in 2000, just now, Mr. Chu mentioned that, and the Tsai Ing-wen has changed the name from the Republic of China to Republic of China. Parenthesis is Taiwan. Actually, that's what I predicted in 2005. 15 years ago, I delivered talk and talking about how Taiwan Authority will slice the tsunami toward the independence. Now you still can get it on the internet, and it's available. And then I think the other thing, I think there's some people in the US and in Taiwan, and just like Bonnie said, based on their argument for ambiguity because of China will take over Taiwan within 2022 to 2027. Well, actually, this is a prediction, or a kind of rumors made by a person from the Renmin University. I doubt, and this kind of judgment or prediction is solid, based on any solid information or fact. It's my understanding is based on imagination. finally, I think we should really learn this experience. Just now, Mr. Chu mentioned that Chen Shui-bian at the very dangerous period stopped doing something. I think that is personally, I attribute this this result to Tom Christensen's efforts. And Tom Christensen and gave advice to Bush to have a clarified policy toward Taiwan. So at that time, and Tom was so worried about the Philippines authority to twist the Americans' foreign policy. So he even translated the American statement into Chinese by himself. So that's why I use this case to support my argument. Strategic clarity will help to stabilize the situation across Taiwan Strait.
Well, Professor Yen Shui Tong, thank you so much for that. You've been very bold and very atypical in your thinking. So it was great to have you here. Choi Ren, Bonnie Glaser, Richard Haass. This has been a fantastic discussion. I think if there's any points of consensus we reached, it was number one, that the Taiwan issue is going to remain at the top of the US-China agenda. It's one of the issues of war and peace, so we need to be very attentive to it. And number two, I think there was a point of consensus that Chinese coercion of Taiwan is growing, economic coercion, diplomatic and military. And the question is, what is the best set of strategies, policies, and tools to address that? And I think there was clearly a range of viewpoints across the panel today. Again, let me thank all of you for sharing your views. For the Americans, today is a holiday, so thank you for spending your holiday morning with us. I'm Evan Medeiros. This is the Georgetown University webinar sponsored by Asian Studies and the US-China Dialogue. We're going to be doing more of these, so please stay in touch, and I look forward to hosting more of these in the future. Thanks to all of you today. Thank you.